let's dive into the subject of today, which is electric guitar EQ. My name is Tyson, and I am a mixing and mastering engineer at Night Owl Music Group. So let's dive in. We're gonna talk about the problems, and we're gonna talk about all the solutions that we can have using EQ with our electric guitars. The first problem with electrics is that they are all weak to ground type Pokemon. All right, that was a bad joke, I'm sorry. The first one is lack of meat in the low end of the guitars. The next one is having hollow or muddy sounding guitars, lack of aggressiveness with your guitars, having guitars that are either too harsh or too dull, and then the last one is the real art of guitar EQ when it comes to not just getting the right tone for your guitars, but actually putting them in the context of a real mix. The first thing is the lack of meat in the low end. The fundamental of the guitar is generally around that 100 hertz-ish range. I'll see a lot of my students high passing their guitars way too much. They want to get it out of the kick and the basses way, which is great. However, just by high passing it entirely, you can actually cut off that fundamental of the guitar, and then your guitar is going to sound really weak because it has no meat. And I wanted to show you what that feels like when you actually are cutting off the fundamental of the guitar. Because you can hear that's the fundamental right around that kind of 100 hertz range. And while there is some resonance here around the 80 hertz range that really isn't needed with the guitar, but when it comes to the fundamental, I don't really want to cut it out. So I'm gonna go up to that point, but no higher. So you don't really notice a real change with this high pass. When you first start to actually hear and feel that change, probably means you went too far. So if you're going to choose to high pass your guitars, do it subtly, because I'll see people high passing their guitars all the way up to 200 hertz and it just sounds thin. So that was meat in the low end. The next one we're gonna be covering is having hollow or muddy sounding guitars. So this is gonna be in this mid-range here. So between about 250 and 700 hertz-ish, the real body of the guitar. When we're looking at this range, we can either have too much or too little of it. And what that's going to end up with is if we have too little, we're going to end up with a very hollow sounding guitar. And then that is opposed to having too much body in your guitars, which are then going to end up with a very muddy sounding guitar. So let's dive into the DAW and just kind of demonstrate these two for you. Here's our rhythm guitar. Let's go to this range here in the middle where our body of the guitar is living. So let's try to boost it, and then you'll kind of hear how much mud there's added to this. So that's too much. Here's too little. You might actually like this character in solo. So let's listen to this in context. Might actually sound good in solo, but definitely does not sound very good in the context of the entire mix. You might be boosting here once in a while if your guitars are lacking that body. Late beginning to early intermediate mixing engineers where they're starting to just figure out that there's a lot of mud in this range, so they just start cutting it out of everything, including the guitars, which again is a massive mistake if your guitars are lacking this body. All right, so the next one is lack of aggressiveness. It's gonna be in this kind of 2 to 3K range is where all of that aggressiveness is going to live with your guitars. So if your guitars sound really dead, probably lacking some of that 2K range. If you add too much, you can also have a little bit too harsh and aggressive. So I think these guitars definitely could use a little bit more aggression here. I'm going to back mid-range off a little bit here, and we should be good there. The next problem is having too harsh or too dull sounding guitars. And you could kind of hear some of this as I was boosting that 3K range, especially just a little bit above it. 4K and above range is really where that harshness or dullness is coming from. And sometimes we'll need to get very surgical with our moves here if there's just some really harsh frequencies that are coming out through the guitar. It's all about balance of having enough harshness, but not too much harshness. Let's dive into the top end of the guitar and talk about the either harshness or dullness that you might be getting out of your guitars. So if anything, these guitars could be a little bit dull because as I'm boosting here, right, it's bringing out a lot of that definition, a nice quality to it overall. But if I'm over boosting here, right, it's gonna sound really, really harsh. So this guitar is sounding pretty good. A lot of times too, just a little bonus here, you might end up with a lot of harshness in this kind of 10K and up range. And that's really not necessary for the guitar. There's gonna be a lot of cymbals there and other things living in that range. So sometimes you'll find out a low pass here can do you some good with your guitars. Now we're gonna dive into the bonus, which is the real art of guitar EQ. The kick lives in this fundamental range. The vocals live in this kind of 500 to 1K range. The guitar basically overlaps with every single major item when it comes to all these other elements. And so when we're talking about how to EQ guitar, it's not about EQing it in solo. It's really about building those relationships between all of the various elements in the mix so that the guitar fill in where all the other elements are lacking, or getting the guitar out of the way for those other elements to live. And we're actually going to EQ all of the guitars in this mix. We're going to create some real clarity in our mix, also really figure out where our guitars should be living. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to strategically go through the mix and identify what the guitar is actually hiding, and then I'm going to apply strategic EQ moves to fit everything in exactly the way that I want it to. I'm going to start at the bottom of the frequency spectrum and then move up. So let's listen to the bass and the kick drum. So I can see it's pretty strong around this like 125 range. Probably going to want to watch out for with my electrics. Another way you can test this out is just play the mix and then mute the guitars. When I mute the guitars, other things are clearer. That means that the guitars are masking those elements. So listen to the bass specifically. So you can tell how much clearer that bass is when I mute these guitars. That means that there is some masking going on. With our electrics, it's really gonna be in this range down here where it's covering up the guitars mostly, or the bass, excuse me. And so that's the range we're gonna be focusing on. Ton of clarity is being brought out by that bass with reducing kind of that fundamental area. So let's dive into the lead guitars as well here. First thing is we want to figure out where they're living inside of the mix. They are living in this kind of 2K range here, mostly. Try 2.2. There's also some, again, low end here. I'm just gonna cut that off. We also have this solo lead as well, so let's see what that thing's doing. I think that kind of 3K range is going to do that one some good. Bring it forward in the mix, right? And so I'm going to do a quick pocket here and reduce that 2.2K range just a little bit. And we're going to do the same thing over here. We're just going to grab this and reduce that 3K really quick. A couple decibels is plenty here. More clarity, there's separation between those two elements that's being brought in. We have to go back to our rhythm guitars that we also have some issues with. We did reduce it out of the way of the bass. We boosted these, yeah, right in that kind of 2K range. So we might have to move this down a little bit just to make room for those other elements that we already changed here. So I like that kind of 4.5K still, but I'm gonna go to the bus here and I'm gonna be reducing kind of a broader sweep where those other guitars were living and then do a little bit more aggressive boost at that 1.6K range. Here is before. All these guitars have their own little tiny space. Let's listen to it in context with the entire mix now. So here's without any EQ. So you can tell how much more focused these guitars truly are after this EQ and this change, just pocketing them in there. Also, that bass sounds awesome now, poking through that mix a little bit. Remember, it's more about building those relationships with the other elements than just EQing it in solo by itself. And if you're interested, there is a free guide. It is the instrument equalization guide. This goes through all of the tonal EQs for all of the common instruments that you'll find in the description of this video. Again, it's totally free. If you want to learn my entire process of mixing objectively professional mixes, find a link to the book down below as well. So can't wait for you to dive into that, and I'll see you on the inside. If not, I'll catch you in the next video.